All right, let's begin. Welcome everyone for this book talk. First question to everyone. How many of you are engineers in this room? Quite a few, right? One, two, three, Prajakta. Here. Quite a few, right? So typically in most batches of IIMA, over 80% of students have been engineers. Nowadays it's a bit less. But engineering is a very fascinating, the craze for engineering in India, late 20th century, early 20th century. Today we have an engineer who's an expert on engineers, right?
But not on engineering.
A lapsed engineer who's now a prolific historian. He's This is the second book. His first book was on how engineering really becomes a profession in the early 20th century. I've read that book. That really, I learned a lot in terms of different ways in which under colonial India engineering really got established. And today's book is about an individual, arguably the greatest engineer that most of you all know. Engineers Day is named after this person in South India, complete huge icon in Karnataka. But across India, I think everyone knows something or the other about Visvesvaraya. And as I started reading this book, I realized how much I did not know, which is a hallmark of a good biography, right? That is, you realize that there's just so much. And of course, there is a lot because as you see the size of this book, it's 800 pages, something like 200 pages of just footnotes, extremely well researched. It took about 10 years, I think, for him to really... Seven. Since ideation, delivery, it's been 7 years. And he's traveled a lot, not just across India, different archives, the places he's been to, that is Visvesvaraya has been to. It's really getting into the skin of the character, right? So Aparajith's right now a faculty at Ahmedabad University. Before that, he's been associated with various other institutions, especially in the UK, different fellowships and so on. So hand over to you to give us a brief flavor of the book, and then I'll be in conversation with him for a little bit, and then open it out for you all for questions. All right, over to you.
Thank you, Chinmay. So firstly, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Vikram Sarabhai Library, Dr. Chand, Meeral Bhai, for inviting me here, and Chinmay for arranging this and for doing this conversation. I'm going to read out an abridged version of the introduction of the book so that we cover some broad points about Visvesvaraya's life, and also you get a flavor of the book along with that. And then this will take about 10 minutes, I hope, not too much more than that, and then we'll go into questions. Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya was easily the most famous Indian engineer of the 20th century, but he's also much more. It's been more than 6 decades after his death, and there's scarcely a walk of life in India that doesn't bear in some form the imprint of his work, not only as civil engineer, but also as public administrator, constitutional analyst, and economic thinker. So if you've picnicked in the Brindavan Gardens near Mysore, if you've studied in Bangalore's Indian Institute of Science, if you've studied in Mumbai's Institute of Chemical Technology, earlier known as UDCT, if you've lived through the heyday of the Planning Commission, if you're a farmer near Pune or Mysore, if you're a Hyderabadi whose drinking water comes from Usman Sagar or Himayat Sagar lakes, or if you swear by Mysore sandal soap, you have experienced directly a part of Visvesvaraya's legacy. Visvesvaraya was born in a village called Mudenahalli near Bangalore in 1861, around the time the British Crown formally took over in India. He began his career as a public works engineer in the Bombay Presidency, where he spent nearly a quarter of a century. And this is really important for us to realize because most of us think his life started with his career in Mysore, but he had already spent almost an entire career before he even became that well known. As a government engineer and later as a consultant, he contributed to the design, building, and maintenance of large irrigation works, dams, and urban water supply and drainage schemes across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. As he approached the age of 50, he accepted the position of chief engineer and later Diwan or prime minister of the princely state of Mysore, his home state. There he pursued ambitious public works projects as part of a program to industrialize the state. He was instrumental in the inauguration of a gigantic multi-purpose dam project on the river Kaveri, the institution of the first university in princely India, the establishment of several industries, including an iron factory at a time where there were very few. In fact, there were only two other factories producing iron in the country, and the founding of a bank and a chamber of commerce in Mysore. In retirement, and this was really only halfway through his actual career, in retirement, Visvesvaraya placed himself on the All India stage. In addition to being on a number of committees and related to engineering and technical education, which we would expect, he also developed a distinctive vision for national development. So he was one of the pioneering proponents of economic planning and a tireless campaigner for Indian industrialization. It's interesting to see this photograph. You can see right here, this is Visvesvaraya. He's the chairman or the president of the 7th Indian Economic Conference. This is not an engineering conference. This is the Indian Economic Conference, the premier conference for professional economists at that time. And he was invited to be the president, which really is quite astounding in some ways. I mean, you can't imagine that happening very easily in other contexts. And that's one of the things I want to understand. You know, how does this happen? Maybe just after I finish. Yeah. Okay. But if you want a clarification, I'm happy to stop. Sure. VG Kale was one. He was actually supposed to be in charge and he couldn't make it at that time. The NC Vakil, I think. There were a few others. Of course, Gadgil, DR Gadgil. Anyway, so the ideas that Visvesvaraya developed on economics and planning, he then promoted through a number of books, such as Reconstructing India, 1920, Planned Economy for India, 1934, Nation Building, 1937, Reconstruction and Post-War India, 1944, and so on. As scholars have argued, Visvesvaraya's vision, with its emphasis on large-scale industry, technical education, and planning, formed a precursor to Nehru's nation-building program after independence. They differed on many things. For example, Visvesvaraya thought that the emphasis on the public sector and socialism was not to his taste. But when you really look at it from the vantage point of, in hindsight, what really stands out is the common features between the development visions of these two men. Both of them were part of one of the earliest cohorts to receive the Republic's highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, 1955. So it would actually be no exaggeration to say that Visvesvaraya's life mirrored the emergence of the modern Indian nation. He came of age as colonial rule reached its zenith. He was in his 20s when the Indian National Congress was formed, in his 50s when World War I shook colonial rule. He was nearly 70 when Mahatma Gandhi took out the Salt March. And by the time he was done with the business of life, he had witnessed not just the coming of independence, but also the first 3 general elections and the first 2 5-year plans of the new republic. Today, Visvesvaraya is enjoying a resurgence as a national icon. His memory is invoked frequently in the context of nation building. His birthday is celebrated every year, as you said, as Engineers Day. Metro rail stations have been named after him in Delhi, Bangalore. A swanky new air-conditioned railway terminal in Bangalore as well bears his name. Educational institutions have his name. So do new government schemes, scholarship schemes, and so on. In Karnataka, he has long been deified. Statues, busts, and portraits of this former Diwan of Mysore are to be found in public parks, residential localities, street corners, shops, factories, institutions of various kinds. Even Google carried a doodle on his birthday in 2018. You can see the picture on the left is actually in Mandya district. It's outside a Ganesh temple, and it says Annadata Visvesvaraya. So because of his dam and his irrigation works, he's seen as the person who made it possible to grow food in the region. And on the right, that's a statue outside the Institution of Engineers in Bangalore. So a lot is known about Visvesvaraya. So what's the need for another book? Well, a number of reasons. Firstly, part of his appeal lies in his image as an apolitical technocratic champion of development. Technological solutions to challenges of governance enjoy wide popularity today. But at the same time, there's increasing public debate on the limits of such visions, not least from the viewpoint of sustainability and the environment. Are large multipurpose dams the best way to serve the aims of electricity generation and irrigation? Is large-scale industrialization the only route to poverty alleviation? To what extent is economic autarky or self-sufficiency necessary or useful for a nation? In this context, the need for a deeper understanding of Visvesvaraya's life and a nuanced appreciation of his legacy in all its shades is growing more urgent. There are other reasons too why it's time for a reappraisal. Despite the fact that he is everywhere as an icon, he remains a cipher to most Indians, at least outside of Karnataka. We know the iconography of him, the frail, unsmiling, turbaned visage, but very little about the frailties, the foibles, the negotiations that were involved in his career, and so on. And not only that, he was very much more than a Mysore-wide or Karnataka-wide figure. He was a national figure. He had a huge influence at the national level, and not just as an engineer. In fact, I'm going to argue that Visvesvaraya was an important figure in India's political history, despite his image as an apolitical person, one who deserves to be studied as seriously as Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tilak, or Bose. He was deeply involved in the vital constitutional debates of his day. He negotiated with viceroys and maharajas. He played an important role in the fortunes and outlooks of the princely state. In many ways, he was an honorary member of the Indian liberals, the intellectual descendants of Dadabhai Nauroji, who's not on this slide, and M.G. Ranade, who's at the top. He was also a close associate of moderate Congress leaders such as Gokhale, G.K. Gokhale, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and M.R. Jayakar, working closely with the last two of them during the 1920s to push for a roundtable conference. So the famous roundtable conference that happens in the 1930s, there's a group of people who's working for nearly 10 years to push for this to happen, and Visvesvaraya is very much a part of that. These are cartoons made by a cartoonist named Emery Kellen at the conference. Visvesvaraya wasn't invited in the end, but these two gentlemen were. Third reason is that the engineering side of Visvesvaraya's career too requires deeper analysis. He's popularly thought of as the greatest or the first modern Indian engineer. But I know, and we know from other research and my own research in my previous project, that there were several other accomplished Indians in the engineering profession before his time, during his time, and after his time. Just take three examples. On the far end, you see Gangaram, Lala Gangaram, who's known as the father of modern Lahore, has hospitals named after him in Delhi and Lahore. On the left, you see Rajendranath Mukherjee, whose company was involved in building the Victoria Memorial and several other landmarks in Calcutta. And in the center, you see A.N. Khosla, who was head of the Central Water Power Commission and was involved with Bhakra Nangal and other major projects. So how is it that Visvesvaraya acquired this iconic and exceptional image? And how did his work as an engineer shape his later thinking as a development thinker? Finally, we know little about the man, his strengths and his foibles, as I just mentioned. The public's understanding of his historical role is shaped largely by reverential and even hagiographic accounts, anecdotal history, and indirectly by Visvesvaraya's own rather reticent autobiographical writings. Placed in the pantheon of national heroes, he ceased to be a person. So if we are to do justice to his life and career, we must peel back the layers of the public persona. What made this idealistic and fastidious personality tick? What gave him his unshakable belief in the possibility of turning India with its bewildering diversity of peoples into a melting pot, a uniform, homogeneous, modern nation modeled on Western exemplars? So these were the questions that I set out to explore. I decided I wanted to pay close attention to the engineering side of Visvesvaraya's life. As I just said, most popular accounts skip over this very quickly, and I think it's important to really dig into this. I wanted to look at how his training as an engineer and his influence, what were his influences, what was his philosophy of irrigation, and how did his experience in this phase influence his thinking on other issues later on. Second, I wanted to stress the historical context in which he worked. Rather than portraying him as a timeless genius who descended fully formed onto the earth, I wanted to understand the prevailing trends in engineering and how his work fit into that story. Third, I wanted to bring to life the intellectual and official engagements with other people that shaped Visvesvaraya's life. Nobody lives in a vacuum, not even geniuses. And in this book, I spend a lot of time, therefore, exploring the lives of his industrialist friends, his bureaucratic colleagues, his subordinates, the teachers of his youth, the Diwans of Mysore who preceded him, and the royals of Mysore under whom he worked. Finally, I decided the book's narrative would be firmly anchored in what historians call primary sources. As scholar Chandan Gowda has noted, myths and unverifiable stories about Visvesvaraya abound. How many of you have received the WhatsApp forward in which says that Visvesvaraya was in a train one day in the middle of the night, and then he pulls the chain, and then somebody comes and says, "Why did you pull the chain?" And he says, "I could hear from the noise of the vibrations that there's a crack in the track in front of me." Um, right? So how can we go beyond this kind of myth making? How can we ensure that we are getting at the person who was great, no doubt, but the nature of that greatness has to be explored in more careful ways. So I thought one must prioritize contemporary sources, newspaper reports, official documents, letters, memos, and triangulate between them. So we found places, I found these sources in archives and institutions, various cities, like you said, Chinmay, Delhi, Bangalore, Mysore, Mumbai, even London. Tried to go and look at places where he had been, institutions where which he had set up, and get a sense of the atmosphere, speak to people who had thought about his legacy, and so on. Counterfactuals are never easy, but it's hard to imagine Indian history without M. Visvesvaraya. His legacies are many and varied. His story is also the story of irrigation in the subcontinent, the story of princely India in a time of great flux, of technology and industrialization in an incipient nation, of the conundrum of what it meant to be a scientific Indian. That's the story that this book tries to tell. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for this overview. I'm going to, this been conversation for a bit, and then open it out for your questions. Maybe let's begin with a bit of the stuff which we really don't know anything about, which is his family, right?
You want to sit here, or
maybe I'll sit there. Yeah, I think that looks better. And I was struck by this line in his book, which roughly goes at something like this: by the age of 30, Visvesvaraya was thrice married, twice widowed, once separated, and childless. Now, how does this really bear on his life overall at that time? And how does he kind of move on from that kind of a massive setback he has in his 20s?
Yeah. So thanks, Chinmay. That's a really important question. I think the popular view of Visvesvaraya is this kind of this celibate, eternal bachelor who is focused only on work and has kind of sublimated all of his earthly needs into his project of nation building. And that's not entirely wrong. I think from the age of 30, he did live a very solitary life, in the sense that he had his mother and his brother and so on, but he didn't have close friends in the way that you and I understand the term. He had associates, people with whom he discussed ideas, people with whom he discussed projects, but he didn't let his hair down. He didn't go, he didn't have gossipy letters or anything of this kind. But the tantalizing question is, was that how his life was going to be, no matter what? Was that something inherent in his character, or was it, to a large extent, a product of accident? Again, a counterfactual, one can imagine what his life might have been like had his family survived. We have some accounts in family lore that his first marriage was quite happy, and that they had a companionate marriage. We are talking about the 1880s, which is when marriage was a very different thing from what it is now. But at the time, it is obviously a rude shock to him. We have, and then we are told that, again from family sources, that he was not really keen on marrying a second and third time, but he was convinced. And there's a small line in his kind of official documents which just gives, which says on leave on personal affairs or something, and that sort of coincides with the likely time when his second wife died. So this was a time, this is the 1880s, there are very few sources, so unfortunately we can't really get at what he was thinking, what he was going through. He was a very, very private person. He was not yet famous, so there are no newspaper reports, so we have to imagine what this must have been like for him. And I think it is clear that these events, which occurred over the period of 5-6 years, must have really left a deep psychological impact on him, because after that he just poured himself into his work, and never really moved from that path. I think that given what one can gather about his nature and his interests, he would still have been a workaholic, but perhaps not, on the scale that we came to know later.
Yeah. Also, what strikes me is the fact that life expectancy is really low. The fact that a lot of these people in his family died young when he was born in 1861. That's also an interesting part of the book. We don't really know his birth date. Two different days or dates that exist in the literature. And at that time,
I argue that we do. I mean, for all official purposes, his birthday is the day that he claims it is, and he puts it in all his official documents. I mean, it's just that chroniclers have, for various reasons, I think some of them go by the horoscope, some of them go by something else, but we have an official date.
Yeah. And he didn't play under 14 cricket, so he had no incentive to fudge his birth date. Yeah. He was born at a time when life expectancy in India was about 25. So if you're born in 1860s, you could expect to live only 25 on average, right? And he lived more than 100 years, right? So that's one remarkable aspect. He's one of the few Indians in history who have lived more than 100 years. And as a biographer of a person who lives really long, that's one of the reasons this book is so big. How do you even write a book? How do you kind of break down writing? Do you make it equal every decade, 10%, or where the sources are? How have you gone about kind of just understanding this long life?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't. The answer is, I think you don't plan it out. You start working with what you've got, and then you see what shape the material takes, and then see whether the story you're telling answers the questions that you set out to answer based on your curiosity. And I think if you look at this book, certainly the first part of his life is perhaps has fewer pages per year than the middle part of his life, because that's when he was most well known. That's when he generated the most documentation. We know about what he was doing, but also because he was a school student, he was a college student, he was not yet doing anything extraordinary in the early years. So what is it that's important for us from our point of view to understand? And I talked about the questions that I'm trying to answer. What is his worldview? So when you're talking about the early life, I need to find out who are the influences, who are the people who shape the way he's thinking, the way he thinks about the goals of development, the way he thinks about the idea of progress. I argue that it's a very Victorian idea shaped by the British professors he had in school and college. So you're looking to zero in on some of those things. And I think you also want to get a sense of, what are the influence, the impactful, the dramatic moments. You want to spend more time on those times when things are more or less, going on a predictable path. Maybe you can summarize them in shorter time frame. So not time frame, in fewer pages. But having said that, I think you'll find that this book is fairly evenly divided into 3 phases. The first phase I call becoming an engineer, the second becoming an administrator, and the third, what is the third one? Becoming a statesman. And then it's on the national stage is the third one. And so these are the 3 phases of his life. Obviously, they inform each other. It's not like, it's act 1, act 2, act 3, but you're in each phase, you're trying to understand certain key questions about his development. It's a long life. There's a lot to cover. I think my idea was actually, in some ways, when I started, my worry was that I wouldn't have enough to make a book, not that there would be too much material. precisely for the reasons that I said earlier, which is that he was not someone who was very very verbose in his letters. He's not someone who had lots of close friends who could tell you what he was like. But the approach I took was, in each phase of his life, not only understand what he's doing, but understand the world around him. So what is happening around him? Who are the other people? What are the expectations? What is the work culture in the PWD if he's working there? What's happening in Mysore? What are the people before him putting in place? What is he inheriting as a system, right? And once you start doing all of this, all kinds of nuggets crop up. And so I think to a book about a person need not mention that person on every page. But even when you're talking about other people and other things, you are shining a light on his life in some
And
way.
I think that's something which I really liked about the book, because there were pages on the different divans of Mysore. So you can also place him in context of people who came, before him and so on. If you now take those three parts of your book, let's start with the first one. I think most of us actually don't know that he spent almost 25 years of his life pretty much around Pune, back then called Pune, and in Western India. And I think there are a few Maharashtrians here in this room. So tell us a bit about that. You mentioned, people like Gokhale, Tilak, Ranade, stalwarts of freedom movement and so on. What is his social circle? What are his contributions, let's say, in that part of his life? For example, he founding member of the Deccan Club, something I had no clue about. And also, this is a time period where he's essentially working for the British bureaucracy. In the sense, does he become, like a British supporter in this particular time?
That's a really, really interesting question. I think one of the things that makes him stand out as a bureaucrat at this time, and engineers like him in the public works department were bureaucrats, right? They were like, they were civil servants as much as technical people. One of the things that stands out is the freedom with which he spent time with people who could be perceived as critics, however moderate, of the colonial establishment. So the fact that he's spending a lot of time with Gokhale and Ranade. Of course, Ranade himself was a judge, so he was part of the bureaucracy. But and then the institutions that they formed, the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, Deccan Sabha, these are reformist organizations. They are organizations that are very, very moderate, but they are still asking tough questions of the administrations. For example, the great famines of the late 19th century, Ranade's Sarvajanik Sabha is making independent assessments of government action during that time. He was not afraid to be seen to be mingling with these people, but he was also able to make it very clear that he was a so-called loyal employee of the state. And so, for example, when he went to Japan of his own accord in 1898, he came back and he records that he wrote up some impressions, but he didn't publish them because he was afraid. He was a great admirer of Japan, and he was afraid that it would be perceived as a critique of the colonial state because they were not doing the things that Japan was doing. So he was careful in that sense, but there was a tendency among people in the colonial establishment to look down upon what were known as non-officials. So in the terminology of the time, non-officials are basically people not employed by the state, who may be representatives of various communities or, doing other things. Even as Diwan of Mysore later, his contemporaries remarked that he gave a platform to non-officials in a way that had not been done before. So this was clearly something that he made it a point to do, to talk to people outside of his own sort of official circles, and that was very important. Pune at this time, 19th century, a great intellectual center, center of emerging nationalist thought, center of social reform, different factions. You have the moderates with Tilak and with Ranade and Gokhale, and then Tilak drifting towards a more radical muscular nationalism on the other hand. And it's clear that he was more on the side of Ranade and Gokhale rather than with Tilak. But he knew all of them. he spent time with all of them. He surely attended the industrial congresses, industrial exhibitions that were being set up at this time. He must have surely read the Maratha and the Kesari, which another historian, Ross Bassett, talks about very nicely in the late 19th century. These magazines are talking very passionately about technical education, about what's happening in the US and Japan. They're talking about MIT. They're reproducing the prospectus and details from it. They're telling Indians, you must go and study in Japan and America. The subtext is these are countries who are doing it better than Britain, right? And this was a way of expressing your anti-colonial sentiments and aspirations. So he was very much a part of that milieu. At the same time, in his deportment, in his bearing, in his writing, in his choice of words, in the way he conducted himself, he was, a quasi-Englishman, and he was treated as such by his superiors.
Did he probably think in English?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's no doubt about it. In his collected papers, you see very few cuttings where he may have scribbled something in Kannada, but almost everything is written in English.
Did he write an autobiography? Or
he did, yes. So he wrote something called Memoirs of My Working Life in 1951 when he was about 90. But I think more than an autobiography, you can consider it an extended CV. Right. It was basically, this is what I did. This at this age, I did this, these projects, and so on. It's very, very taciturn to the extent that he doesn't even do justice to himself. Right. He's not that he's praising himself. It's just that his impulse seems to be just to record all the things he's been part of. Maybe he was not, he didn't have the energy at that stage to embark on a more thorough project. But yes, that's what he produced.
So his 25 years stint in Pune is associated with lots of hydraulic projects. If you're around Pune, lots of the dams around them. In those 25 years, he rises up the hierarchy and so on. He could probably become the chief engineer of the entire thing, but then something interesting happens. He kind of leaves. And so tell us about that story. And the thing that struck me really interesting was he goes and he just starts traveling, right? He goes abroad. And 1 year of his life, it's like a gap year of his life, and he just starts traveling, which I think is really nice. Yeah. So tell us about, how does he decide to quit the service?
That's great. I hadn't thought about that, but he is the father of the gap year. And because he did it not just once, he did it 2 or 3 times. When he went to Japan in 1998, he took several months off. In 1908, when he was about to quit the Bombay PWD, he took a year off almost. And then he did it again in 1919. So what happened? Actually, Visvesvaraya was promoted quite rapidly for an Indian in the PWD. Now, remember, this was a racially sort of charged atmosphere in the sense that Indian engineers were looked down upon for a large period of his career by their British bosses for various reasons. They said Indians can master mathematics and differential equations and technical stuff, but they don't have the character it takes to be a good engineer, which meant they're not a man of character. Had to be someone who was supposedly incorruptible, who was physically active, who could take decisions easily, and so on. Basically, a code word for saying somebody has to be a British public school kind of product. And in that atmosphere, compared to a lot of other Indians, he actually did very well. But, it's a mark of his, I suppose, his self-respect or whatever, that he still felt that he wasn't getting his due. So he got something called the Kaisari Hind Medal in 1906, I believe. When he's in his mid-40s. It's a huge honor, right? As far as the colonial state is concerned. It's bestowed by the Emperor of India, the Queen or the King, as the case may be, and it's for outstanding services and so on. And he gets this, and there's this kind of tantalizing correspondence where he's writing to his superior and saying, I don't want this. My friends are telling me don't take it. It's an insult, and so on. Can you imagine? Why would he think of this as an insult? And it turns out that, again, the correspondence is incomplete, but what I could piece together is that there was a gold and a silver version of the Kaisari Hind, and he was offered the silver. Okay, so he felt that that was a slight in some sense, and so he records in his memoirs that in his late 40s he felt that it would be a long time before he could become chief engineer. Actually, no Indian, I think, at that point had ever become chief engineer in the PWD. So he decided that he must look for other things. But I think there were other factors at play. One was, of course, that Mysore was sending out feelers. He was from princely state, and princely India was a place where Indians could get higher ranks and jobs than in British India for various reasons. And so clearly his home state was trying to lure him back. And by the time he was ready to quit the Bombay PWD, I think he had a good sense that he would have avenues open to him at a higher level in Mysore. Basically, his ambitions had outstripped his official position, right? As an official bureaucrat, he would be in charge of, you're in charge of a circle, a division, and then maybe as chief engineer, a province. But he wanted not just to be, by that stage, he was not only thinking about, okay, I'll be head of irrigation for this province, but he had ideas about education, about boosting the economy, about industrialization and all of this. And he wanted an avenue to be able to explore those things.
Yeah. And after his travels, before going to Mysore, he had actually spent some time in Hyderabad. I don't know how many of you know, there was a devastating flood, the 1908 Musi flood, killed, I think, more than 10,000 people in pretty much one day. And he was rushed in to kind of provide a solution. And eventually that solution became what was the Himayat Sagar and Osman Sagar dams around Hyderabad. So an interesting interlude before he goes to Mysore. Now he comes to Mysore in roughly 1909 or so, 1909. And then over the next decade, he becomes a real kind of a star, right? First, take us to his relationship with the royalty, right? So Mysore is known to be having that royal family. How does he become close to them? Do they like him? Is there some friction between him, or are they so close that it upsets others who are already potential divans and so on? Because he joined as an engineer and then he becomes a divan, which is some sort of a prime minister role, right? So it's a super promotion in that sense. So take us to that journey, say 1909 to 18.
Yeah, absolutely. He joins as chief engineer in 1909, and in 1912 he becomes divan. As you said, it's unprecedented. No engineer before has become a divan of a state. People are, but it was already clear in his first 2-3 years as chief engineer that he was headed somewhere, because he, right from the beginning, he kind of he upset the status quo. He wanted to change the way things were going, and you can see this very clearly in very detailed documentation of minutes and letters on various projects that are happening. That's the time when he sets up, he gets what becomes the Kaveri Dam, the KRS Dam, underway, and there are many internal critics as well. People are saying, this is crazy. This is a waste of public money. This is, the job of the state is not to do all of these developmental things, but it's to just balance the budget and keep money for emergencies, right? And he's coming in with a very different mindset. So when he comes in, he certainly has, he has the year of the Maharaja. The Maharaja shares some of his modernizing impulse. He's also a creature of a product of very British education, because the kings were educated by British tutors from their childhood, and then they sort of their get-up was very sort of exotic, Oriental, whatever, the stereotype of the Oriental prince, but the British made sure that their mental makeup was very sort of Western in some sense. So in a lot of ways, I think broadly their visions aligned. And Visvesvaraya was able to exert pressure on the Maharaja in several instances. He says himself, when the KRS Dam project was kind of stalled because it had several problems. There were objections from external parties as well as internal. But then he basically threatened to quit, and the Maharaja eventually sort of said, okay, we'll push it through, and got him back. And then in the subsequent 6 years as Diwan, there were ups and downs. The first 2-3 years, everybody felt he was the chosen one, and that whatever he wanted would get done. And ultimately, in the last 2 or 3 years, he's writing several times to Maharaja saying, I want to quit, I'm not happy, you're doing all of these things that I don't agree with. There's some pretty emotional letters back and forth, and eventually he quits in 1918. So it's a complicated relationship. I think the key point is not to think about them as personalities only, but to understand the political economy of a princely state. And the fact is that he's Diwan or Prime Minister. He has a cabinet, the equivalent of a cabinet. He has other people. Yes, there are other people over whom he vaults to become Diwan. H.V. Nanjundaya, famous educationist, anthropologist, who was in line to become Diwan, misses his chance. But after that, at the end of the day, it's not a functioning democracy, right? They have some small symbols of democracy. They have a representative assembly, they have legislative council, and indeed Visvesvaraya makes some liberalizing moves within those bodies. But at the end of the day, he's answerable only to the Maharaja. And the Maharaja, of course, is not completely autonomous. He is answerable to the British. He's answerable to public political pressures that are building up at the grassroots. But that's a different story. As far as the makeup of the government goes, he was able to push through some of his grand schemes, partly because he was working in this kind of a setup.
Yeah, in terms of what he did and what I think most people know. So dams, big projects, industries. One of the things which I thought was very interesting was village governance, right? It's not something that comes to top of your mind on what he was doing. Tell us a bit about that. What is he doing in Mysore in the world of village governance? So we know agriculture thanks to dams, but this is something completely different that he's pushing.
Yeah, so he sets up something called the Village Improvement Scheme. He was a great fan of statistics and data, not statistics in the kind of sophisticated sense of, analyzing data, but collecting, documenting, and making comparisons. And he felt that, if you had to solve a problem, you had to first know what was going on, right? And so to collect, very minute data, how many schools are there, how many people are going to school, what is what's being grown, what is the income, etc., etc. And so he set up this thing called the Village Improvement Scheme, which is, in some ways a rather simplistic and idealistic scheme when you look at it. You would go and make these big tours through all various districts, and then he would ask, what do you need? What do you need in this village? What are your primary needs in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, etc., etc. And then he'd push people. He wanted people to create conferences, discuss with local leaders what they needed, etc., etc. But he did push through some very, very important schemes. For example, Gokhale wanted universal education to be pushed through in the Imperial Legislative Council, and it was denied. But Visvesvaraya managed to push through a version of compulsory education in Mysore. It was never a complete success, but at least they really ramped up the provision of primary schools in a huge way during his divanship. So this idea of village improvement schemes, of course, it's a paternalistic idea. It's an idea that people, sitting in positions of power can prescribe what is a healthy, regimented way for a village to work. But it does bear some commonalities with the Gandhian vision, surprisingly, because, of course, he's a famous advocate for industrialization, but he's saying there should be rural industries, there should be some amount of self-sufficiency and so on. But the real inspiration for this comes again from Japan. One of the things that he's really taken with when he goes to Japan is the form of village self-government that he sees there, and takes detailed notes about the way in which it's organized, this kind of concentric circles of power. And the Japan that he sees is a Japan that is has gone through the Meiji Restoration. It's modernizing. It is becoming strong. It's becoming an imperial power, but he doesn't really notice that. He sees it through rose-tinted glasses, and he's very happy. He's very taken with the idea of discipline and uniformity that he sees there. And in some sense, he wants to replicate that in India, which is, of course, very problematic, but that was his aim.
And now the third stage, retirement, which is 40 years of his life. And he does many things in those 40 years. the planning. Take us through a bit of that. How does he get obsessed about this idea of planning and so on? But also, he's on the board of the Tata Steel for decades. So how does he get connected to the Tata Group? So Tatas and planning, two different things. This is like post-60s part of his life.
So, yeah, actually, they're not necessarily connected, the two questions. I mean, his first introduction to various industrialists comes precisely in the time when he's in Pune. You mentioned the Deccan Club. It was a club that he helped set up along with Ranade and Gokhale and others. The idea was to create a social platform for Indians and British to socialize and to talk about various things. And many of the people who'd frequent that were, important community leaders, but also important industrialists. One of them, who was influential in his life, was Vittal Das Thakursi, who was a cotton magnate from Bombay. And he also got to know, and that's the time when he was in the Pune irrigation district, that he also got to know the Tatas. So we know the Tatas tried to get him to advise on some projects related to their hydroelectric scheme in the early 20th century. So he already got, and there were other people like Lalubhai Samaldas, who was also on the board of various Tata companies. So he's making those connections in the early 20th century. He's on the board of Tata Steel from 1927 to 55 or something. So that's much later. But he already knows these people. Sometimes he's engaged on, assignments to investigate, something that goes wrong, or to be on an external committee and things like that. So he's built those contacts. The question about planning. So the interesting thing is that, as I said, in his years in Mysore, he's already he sets up something called the Mysore Economic Conference in 1911. And they're not using the word planning at this time, but it really has many of the features of planning. The idea is to really to tabulate and to have an interface between government and business, and to cooperate and, to direct the economy in a particular way. And these ideas sort of become stronger in his mind. In the 1920s, I showed you that he was the head of the Indian Economic Conference, but in 1925, he was also chairman of something called the Indian Economic Enquiry Committee. And this was a committee, a 3-member committee, set up to basically to figure out what kind of survey is needed to form an estimate of the economic well-being of the Indian population. And there's a backstory to it, but I won't get into that. But he's basically interviewing scores of people, this commission is, and he's trying to understand what is a good measure of well-being? Is it income? Is it, is it property? Is it, how can we solve? All of this sounds very basic to us today, but at this time, he's really at the vanguard of some of these discussions. In 1928, of course, there's the Soviet example. He's watching what Stalin is doing with the 5-year plans and so on. And in 1934, Visvesvaraya comes out with his book, Planned Economy for India. He's certainly not the first person in India to talk about planning, but he's one of the most prominent and early advocates for it. There's Raghavendra Chattopadhyay, who's, I don't know if he's retired from IIM Calcutta, wrote his PhD thesis on the history of ideas of planning, and he lays it out very beautifully. In the 1920s and 30s, planning was the zeitgeist. Everyone was starting to talk about it suddenly. And there are different versions of it. So the colonial government is talking about planning. People like G.D. Birla are talking about planning. Bureaucrat in Bengal is talking about planning. But the most sort of prominent voice is Visvesvaraya. And in the 1940s, of course, we know that J.R.D. Tata is among the many people who write the Bombay Plan, which is another version of planning sort of vision. There's a quote in the book by an economist called Lionel Robbins, who says basically that planning has become such a fad now that everybody is talking about planning and they don't necessarily mean the same thing. When they say they want planning, basically they're saying we want that which is desirable. That is his quote.
All right. So open for questions now. I'm going to ask him one last question. So think about your question and make it very brief. So last question from my side is, they were also critics of Visvesvaraya. Run us through maybe a few of them at different points of time, and how would you describe him? Were these criticisms fair? For example, was he a tough boss? to work with? Was he a tough person to work with in general? Uh, was he too demanding? Was he, did he not care about the views of people who were working under him? How do you describe some of the criticism that came his way?
Sure. There were different kinds of criticisms. As a boss, there's no doubt that he was tough to work for. He was a perfectionist. He was very exacting.
More than 70 hours a week?
Quite likely, very, very likely. In fact, when there was a famine in Bombay and Pune in the 1890s, Public Works accounts examiner writes to him saying, "We are really impressed that in the midst of this famine, your office has got all its accounts up to date. This is really commendable. But apparently your staff is working 12 hours a day. So if you need an extra person to work for your office, please let us know." And there are many stories of others. See, he was this kind of a tough but benevolent boss. So the people who worked for him had to do everything had to be just so. They write about how they had to be dressed, how they had to gum their envelopes without smudging it, and all of this stuff. But then he also kind of stood up for them. I know there are records of his writing for allowances, extra allowances for his staff, and getting them certain perks and raises and so on. So it was that kind of a thing. And there were also people who just didn't get along with him at all. I mean, there's one bureaucrat called Srinivasa Iyengar who worked with him in Mysore. And he maintained a diary which has been edited by another scholar. Of the world, he was being fair, and he wanted to be fair in his way of thinking. But his way of thinking was very different from many other people, and so they did find it tough. But overall, there was, I think, a feeling of respect. The more important criticisms, I think, are the ones that come in the public domain, and they're about his policies, especially the big multipurpose dam, the idea of setting up an iron and steel factory, iron first, later steel in Bhadravati. And while we remember these as really path-breaking projects, the fact is that they were wildly ambitious for their time. And there's always a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done. And they were really pushed through at a time when there was no guarantee that they would be viable. Right? And they were pushed through because he had this vision for it. But there were other people who were asking very legitimate questions about, okay, but what if this falls through? What if this is not a viable venture? And indeed, Bhadravati Steel did not start making money for nearly 30 years. Right? And it survived because the state backed it. Now, it was still a great achievement, technically and otherwise, and organizationally. But it was a legitimate question. And there were people who were writing. There was one very virulent critic who wrote under the pseudonym of Mysore and Truth and other things. He would write incessantly to all the newspapers in the 1920s, criticizing every scheme. When an inquiry committee was set up, he would say, "Oh, but these are Visvesvaraya's proteges. They can't be on the inquiry committee," and so on. And it was really quite nasty at some point. And Visvesvaraya was quite sensitive. He issued lots of clarifications and statements and so on. The question was, is this a legitimate use of public money? And of course, you realize when you look at these that there's no final answer to these questions. It's about your priorities. It's about what you think is a fair sacrifice to demand. But we also realize that there are winners and losers, right? So if money is being spent on certain things, who's sort of having to tighten their belts to make that possible. So I think these are important debates. These are debates that still continue today. The idea that we can have, I talked about technocracy, that we can have big science and tech projects solving social problems, because that's how they were pitched, right? The problem of re-engineering society through these projects. And while in many cases they had admirable results, there were some legitimate criticisms. And I think what is interesting is that he was very sensitive about them, but he never sort of and he was also sort of pushy enough to make sure that he got his way, but he never discounted the criticism. He wanted to face them and to leave a record that he had somehow addressed them.
All right. Open. We have how many? 5 minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes. Just raise your hand. You want to ask a question? 1, 3, 4. Let's take 4 questions first. Short, brief questions. Yeah.
I just want to know that triggering moment that I will go after him. So what that triggering moment that you think that I will go after Visvesvaraya sir, that I will write the book?
That you'll go after.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question.
Do you want to collect questions? Okay.
So this time army engineers were pretty much there. Madras sappers, Madras engineer groups had already come, and Bengal engineers. They were also doing some civil projects like connecting Bombay and Pune, Amritanjan Bridge, and so on. So have you also come across his connections with army engineers and projects with army? So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so how do you sort of straddle like these two zones of academic writing, academic publishing, and something like this, which is more psychom for a broader audience, right? So over a period of 7 years, and were there any sort of syntactic or stylistic sort of decisions that you took to write this, which could make it more accessible to the broader audience?
One last one.
I think he's clearly a very multifaceted personality and has done a lot of work. But I'm still trying to find out, and I think it probably calls for a detailed reading of the book, is about his greatness, So one aspect of something great is that some very high impact and innovative things that he might have done. Could you throw some light on that?
Thank you.
So what prompted you and to innovation? Yeah.
So, question of, I think the answer to your question that he went after me. It was I didn't go after him. His name would just keep popping up everywhere. Of course, all of us come across his name somewhere in school. And we had I think my Hindi textbook had a lesson about him, and the thing I remember now is that what a pain it was to write his name in Devanagari script. So one is aware of him. But when I was doing my previous project, which was the history of the engineering profession, his name obviously comes up very often. But that was a more sort of a sociological history, and I was not looking at individuals so much. There are a lot of hagiographies also, right? There are a lot of accounts which establish that he had done many things, that he's very, very famous, he's iconic, and so on. But there just wasn't a convincing sort of analysis of how he came to be, and what made him what he was, and indeed, how do we assess his greatness? And I'll come to that question in a bit. So I always thought that I would do it. At some point in my life. I would try and write about him. Segueing into your question, I think it was a question of when I would be ready to undertake a different kind of project, because I've trained in writing an academic monograph, which is very different in style and different in its challenges. But as I was kind of trying to think, maybe I'll do it X years down the line, it so happened that an article that I had written caught the eye of an editor at Penguin, and I was commissioned to do this book. So of course, I think they had in mind a 2-year turnaround. It turned out to be 7 years, but that's a different story. So yeah, I think just a very interesting character. I also lived in Bangalore. My first job after my engineering degree was in Bangalore. So I think subconsciously all of these things sort of came together. And of course, the first year or two when I was working on it, I wasn't entirely sure, as I said, would this be a viable project? And you're sort of trying to get to know what's out there. What can you, is this a person? You've got to, you've got to at least feel that there is some part of the person you can empathize with. You don't have to be an advocate for the person, but you have to at least empathize in some way with some part of what they're trying to do if you're going to spend several years with them. And so I think once I had enough of an idea of what kind of a person he was and so on, then I knew that it was a viable project. On your question, certainly, I mean, the Army military engineers were, of course, the first British engineers to start working on public works in the subcontinent. And when the PWD was formed, it was actually Royal Engineers and others who would come and staff it. But at some point, they decided that they needed a separate civilian establishment, and hence the term civil engineer, because their engineers were not part of the army. And so once the civil engineering establishment is created in the PWD, I think their tracks are quite different from the army engineers. The army engineers are then more working on things to do with with army establishments, with military conflict and so on. There is overlap, but the worlds are quite different. So Visvesvaraya worked a lot, of course, with PWD engineers across his career, and he was. He was not a pacifist or anything. In fact, he was very keen on military training, and that was one of the things he took away from Japan. He thought all citizens must have compulsory military training and so on. But I don't have really instances of his working actively with the army in any particular sense, except that in his later career, and this is actually an interesting chapter, he was a big promoter of the projects of creating indigenous manufacture of automobiles and aircraft in India in the 1930s and 40s. And for these projects to be viable, he and the businessman who he was sort of working with, he never had a stake in it, but he was promoting them morally and otherwise. Their main sort of pitch to the government was that they would supply the army with planes and vehicles during World War II and other such conflicts. But otherwise, there's no very direct connection. Your question is really vital to the writing of this book. I think it is very different in the sense that in an academic monograph, there's a certain format. You start out with a literature review, you establish what what is being said, what has been said about the subject, and then you lay out your arguments, and then you have themes in each chapter. It's not necessarily a narrative, although it can be a narrative structure. So with this book, of course, it had to be it had to flow, it had to be a narrative, it had to be more accessible. But I was very, very determined that it should not sacrifice any of the rigor of an academic exercise. In other words, there should be nothing in it, no assertion in it that is not backed by some reasonable research or evidence. And so I think that was the toughest part, how to blend the two things, because you need, sometimes even a sentence or two sentences can have a bunch of sources behind them, and yet you have to make it sort of flow. I think also how to weave in the insights of, because there may not be another big book like this about Visvesvaraya, but there are many people who have written about the history of Mysore, about the history of irrigation, about various other aspects. And this is a person who is doing so many different things, and so you have to understand the background of each of those things, and then so you're relying on academic works on each of those themes. And so how do you bring the insights of those in to form a backdrop to what you're doing, citing those works, etc. But to do so in a way that's not sort of intrusive, right, in the narrative. I think that was a sort of thing that you can only solve by trying it out and drafting and redrafting. But I think it's been very satisfying, and I hope it works. And I hope you'll pick it up and tell me if that has worked. I think you had a second part to your question. Was that
sort of stylistic choices?
Yeah.
Also, do you have any references when it came to sort of working on a Bible?
Yeah. So stylistic choices, I mean, I can think of some. I mean, one which might sound very sort of not very important, but which was for some reason important to me, was I didn't want to have subheadings. Because I think that very often, we have chapters and then we have subheadings and sub-subheadings, and then it becomes like you're writing an algorithm or something. I mean, I really wanted the narrative to carry the argument, and the structure has to be there, but the scaffolding mustn't be visible, right? So that was a stylistic choice that I made. I think that helps hopefully with the fluidity of how you read, how it reads. In terms of references, I mean, yes, I remember having a conversation with my editor about Robert Canigal's book on Ramanujan, which is a book I read much before I became an academic. So it's different, but I really remember that I enjoyed it a lot. It was clearly well researched, but it made you feel emotionally connected with the character. It gave you a sense of what was going through his mind, and it also painted a wonderful picture of Kumbakonam, Tanjavur, of his childhood, and then Cambridge, and all the places he's going. Right. So that's the other thing. I thought that this must be a work which makes you feel like you're there, right? I don't know if I've achieved it, but that was certainly what drove me towards this project. And your question about greatness, I think that this is the fundamental question about a figure like this. What makes him great? What do we mean by greatness? So I think in my book. Greatness, to the sense that, to the extent that we can apply it as a label to a person like this, is a marker of their ambition or the scale of their canvas, right? So his goals, or what he's setting out to do, is clearly at a much more vast level, scale than what your average engineer would set out to do. Average engineer would be happy to execute his project and go on to the next. But he's always viewing these projects in the context of a larger sort of, what's its place in society as a whole? What's its place in, and the sort of animating vision for him is he's convinced, and this is slightly an Orientalist vision. It's influenced by what he's reading about Western views of India, but it's also not untrue. The fact that we were, mired in illiteracy and poverty, and his main aim was to attack material poverty, improve the standard of living, and to get away from what he thought of as a kind of otherworldly, mystical, traditional approach to life, and say, look, as an engineer, you have natural resources, you can extract them, you can make yourself comfortable, you can live well, you can live with dignity, and so on. And of course, we can critique certain aspects of that, but I think that was that was at the crux of what he was thinking. But using that sort of insight, he then spreads into ever wider sort of arenas, right? So he goes into talking about planning. He talks about nation building. He's talking about setting up institutions. He's talking about what are the different parts of society and how they must fit together. So why do you need a university? Why do you need an engineering college? Why do you need a planning body? And why do you need primary education, for instance? And he's remarkably consistent in his views over several decades, which is which is a good thing and a bad thing, because it means that perhaps you're not changing your mind when you see certain things don't work. But on the other hand, it also means that you're very convinced about what you want to do. In terms of tangible achievements, my conclusion in the book is that as an engineer, he was not a whiz. It was not that he was creating innovations that nobody else had thought of. Yes, he made some important innovations, but when you contextualize them against what other people in the department were doing, they were incremental. Others were doing it. He was also doing it. These have been made into certain kinds of icons by retellings without context. But he was very competent. He was a great project manager. I think what he was really good at was getting ambitious projects sanctioned, like making a convincing case for why something should be undertaken. Why should resources be spent on this? And of course, having the daring, because somebody proposing something like that might be worried that what if it doesn't work out? What happens to my reputation? But he really believed that it could be done. And while he didn't do it single-handedly, people think that this person single-handedly built this dam. Obviously not. I mean, there were generations of engineers who worked on it. But if he had not been there, I think it's quite clear that it would not have been sanctioned. It may not have gone through. So I think in that sense, his ambition was vast. I think the other thing is that he went far beyond what you call your comfort zone. So he's spending the 20s talking to people like Malaviya and Jayakar. He actually, very few people know that he wrote a draft constitution for India with dominion status in the 1920s, because he didn't put his name to it, but Jayakar asked him to do it. And so he was actually known in certain circles as a person who knew about constitutions and so on. So he's actually writing this, not a very big one, but he's producing it, and then it's being shipped around to Labour MPs in Britain with a view to getting them to put pressure to grant dominion status to India. He's then becoming head of a movement, not a head, but a face of a movement for what was called the States People's Movements. So this was a movement on behalf of the populations of the princely states who were saying that they needed democratic representation and not just to be governed by Maharajas. And can you imagine, this is a person who worked under a Maharaja for so many years, and then in the late 1920s, he's heading this, at least one of the main conferences. So he's doing a lot of unexpected things. He's sort of spreading wide. Did he have all the right answers? Surely not, especially from our viewpoint. We know certain things about the environmental costs of some of the projects. We know about other things, but not everything was known at that point. Some critics did mention some of them, but I think it's in what you set out to do that greatness lies. It's not in being infallible. Certainly, nobody is infallible, and we mustn't turn them into sort of into godlike figures. I think they have to be humanized.
I think we stop here. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Aparajith, of course, for taking us through the life history of Visvesvaraya. It was very interesting. I hope a lot of us get lots of insight from your book and your talk, of course. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Chinmoy, who agreed to moderate this session. Unfortunately, he had a class, so he has to leave. Thank you all for joining this book talk. Let us join for tea.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I would like to hand over a small memento to Professor Aparajith.